This program contains content that may disturb some viewers.
It was a revolutionary medical implant that failed, with terrible consequences.
I've lost about 2 to 3 inches off this leg.
The pain at night is still horrendous.
How much did the company really know?
The short-term plan was to manage perception. Their words, manage perception. In other words, lie like hell.
Was this a cynical corporate cover-up putting people's lives at risk? Welcome to Four Corners, where tonight we draw on internal company documents, memos and emails to demonstrate the extraordinary extent to which a giant medical company and its subsidiary went to keep an implant on the market that they clearly knew to be faulty, with appalling results. 3 years ago, we reported on the scandal of the DePuy ASR hip replacement, a metal-on-metal device which was implanted in almost 100,000 patients worldwide, including 5,500 here in Australia. The device failed thousands, some of them poisoned by cobalt and chromium. Most have needed further painful and often unsuccessful surgery. While the ASR hip replacement device has now been recalled from use, there have been a growing number of lawsuits, particularly in the United States, against the medical giant Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of DePuy. A class action is due to be heard in Australia early next year. At the heart of these lawsuits are questions about the company's knowledge of the serious flaws in its product and what they did about it. Quentin McDermott reports on what has been described as the biggest disaster in the history of orthopaedics.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the last post. The silence, followed by Ravelli and then the national anthem. Thank you.
God, soldier, arms. God, general salute, present, arms.
As the last post sounds over Queensland's Cuchimudlo Island, an old warrior greets the dawn of Anzac Day. One in the long line of Australia's walking wounded.
Well, I am wounded, and I think it all depends how you carry the wound. And I know, basically, that everything's been done that can be done for me, right? And I have to try and manage that the best I can.
Doug Cope served in the Navy during the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation in 1964, and pain is now a constant in his life. But the wounds that caused it didn't come from a battle fought 50 years ago, they came from a faulty medical implant in his hip. As a consequence, he walks with one leg shorter than the other.
I have a built-up right heel. I've been to podiatrists, and you know it is 27 or 30 mil shorter. So I limp.
Doug Cope is one of a growing band of men and women whose lives have been permanently scarred by a faulty medical implant called the ASR. It came in two versions, one to replace the hip totally, the other to resurface the hip without replacing it. The device was designed, manufactured and marketed by DePuy, a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, the world's largest medical devices company. Nearly 100,000 people received the implants, 5,500 of whom were in Australia. but the implant has failed in a shockingly high proportion of patients. And now those people are holding Johnson & Johnson and DePuy accountable.
Well, I think they have a lot to answer for. They have to be brought to account. These big companies have to take a hell of a lot more care of their, of these people who receive these implants.
Every person who received an ASR implant was hoping for renewed mobility and a new lease of life. But, as Four Corners reported 3 years ago, what many of them got was a life of pain and disability.
The pain at night is still horrendous. During the day, it's not so bad.
Oh, lovely. I've lost about 2 to 3 inches off this leg. When I walk without a shoe on, it's like walking on sponge rubber. Whereas I pick the leg up, it just flops around like that.
When he opened me up, he found that my flesh had turned grey-black around the hip area. The bone, he said, looked like a sewer pipe and was full of a sludgy grey material.
Many patients, like Bob Lugton, have suffered the after effects of cobalt poisoning, as debris from the metal implant broke away, rotted the bone and tissue around the implant, and entered the bloodstream. Bob, it's 3 years since I last saw you. How are you? How's your general state of health?
My general health has been terrible since I had the high cobalt levels. I haven't had a day in years where I've felt completely well. I seem to pick up every virus that's going around, and it's always 10 times worse in me than other people. My hearing's almost gone now. I have trouble with tinnitus in my ears.
So you're pretty crook?
Yeah, I feel really crook all the time. Yeah.
In 2009, the ASR was withdrawn from sale in Australia, and the following year DePuy announced a worldwide recall. Too late for a trail of victims around the world. Even now, despite paying the medical costs for many patients whose ASR implants failed, DePuy refuses to acknowledge that the ASR's design was defective or admit liability for the harm it caused to them. In Australia, a class action has been launched on behalf of hundreds of patients whose implants have failed.
I want to see Johnson & Johnson in court. I want to see them punished for what they've done, purely because I believe they knew well beforehand and didn't stop putting these products in.
The maker of any new medical device that's intended to be implanted in human beings must make sure that before they sell it for use in people, it is safe and effective.
The forthcoming trial of Australia's class action comes in the wake of a landmark case in the United States which was fought and won by another of the walking wounded, Bill Kransky, a Vietnam vet from Montana.
I was very, very active. I was never a couch potato or anything like that. I was always finding something to do, and I can't anymore.
He was a family man, terrific father, very compassionate and loving, would give his shirt to anybody who needed it at any time. Hardworking, very respected, especially in our community, even within our family, very respected. Everybody loved him. Loved him.
Bill Kransky looked forward to an active, healthy retirement. But after having his left hip replaced with an ASR implant, his health declined dramatically.
From the front of this house to the back of it is about 60 feet. It's about as far as I can walk. Then I'm through.
He had no support, lots of pain in his groin, in his back. It got to that point where he couldn't take care of himself.
He discovered that he had kidney cancer, a tumor in one of his kidneys, and he had to have it removed. And then the hip became a problem. And he started having other health issues as well. And that kept going until, he got the ASR out.
Bill Kransky, by this time, was taking legal advice from two San Diego attorneys, John Gomez and Dean Getz.
When John Gomez and I went to meet Bill for the first time, he was really ill. We were concerned, of course, are we going to get involved in this case and then, get close to the finish line and Bill dies and the case is then over. I said, Bill, you're from Montana. You're tough. I said, you need to tell us that you are going to make it. And he paused for a moment. And then he said, yes, Dean, I'm going to make it. I'll be there. I said, okay, we're going to go. We're going to do this.
Bill Kransky's case was the first U.S. case which was tried. Because of his unrelated cancer, he was moved to the front of the list. It was tried in an expedited fashion in Los Angeles.
The lead attorney representing Bill Kransky in court was Mike Kelly from San Francisco. Court orders were obtained obliging Johnson & Johnson and DePuy to hand over more than 70 million pages of internal company records. What Mike Kelly and his team unearthed was the inside story of how, in the interests of sales and profits, the ASR was marketed and the basic flaws in its design were covered up.
Let me tell you the story of what happened in this case. In 1998, an English surgeon developed a hip that was made out of metal, both parts.
Eventually arriving at the Birmingham hip.
The English surgeon referred to by Mike Kelly is Derek McMinn, inventor of the so-called Birmingham hip, or BHR. Like the ASR, it's a metal-on-metal device, but unlike the ASR, it took years to develop.
The Birmingham hip was kept in the hands of 3 surgeons for quite a while, until we were sure that it was fine, and then expanded gradually to a bigger user group.
The Birmingham hip was made by Smith & Nephew, a rival of DePuy and a fierce competitor in the same highly lucrative market in prostheses. Johnson & Johnson and DePuy needed to find a hip resurfacing device which would compete with the Birmingham hip. The solution they came up with was the ASR.
My first reaction was that it looks quite similar to the BHR. And then I started with colleagues a process of investigation to see exactly what they had changed on the BHR to, in quotes, make the BHR better. And it was with some horror that we saw that they had changed a number of things which I and others judged would make the implant worse.
Derek McMinn saw 2 major flaws in the ASR's design compared to the BHR's. The ASR cup was shallower than the BHR, and it had a very low clearance or gap between the ball and socket. These features, unique to the ASR, would lead to the ball of the implant grinding against the edge of the cup and metal debris being shed.
That was one of the concerns I raised, that this implant would be particularly vulnerable to edge loading. And edge loading, as it turns out, is one of the main causes of failure with the ASR device.
Don't be afraid of what it looks like.
6 surgeons helped design the ASR, earning together millions of dollars in the process. They included Adelaide doctor Roger Oakeshott, who implanted more ASR hips than anyone in Australia, around 1,200 in all.
In the case of Penske versus Depew rectal flex.
Inside the company, the man hired to lead the development was Magnus Flett.
What was his background?
Mr. Flett had never before been in charge of managing the design or rollout of any kind of an orthopedic device. His background actually, for the most part, had been in transportation. He had been an engineer in designing and developing brake systems for heavy trucks and other industrial machinery.
In its rush to get the ASR to market, Depew sidestepped a full investigation of the product by the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. No clinical trials were carried out prior to the product being launched. Instead, Depew obtained fast-track authorization from the FDA to market its full hip replacement version of the ASR on the basis that it was substantially equivalent to other brands of metal-on-metal hip. But in fact, it was very different.
We are in Warsaw, Indiana. We design and develop orthopedic joint replacement products.
In this promotional video, a senior Depew engineer describes the tests that are carried out on implants like the ASR.
We simulate walking, so the number of steps that you take. We run these machines for up to 10 million steps to simulate 5-10 years of use in the body.
But what Depew didn't disclose was that the initial lab tests carried out on the ASR were limited in scope and did little to reproduce what happens in real life.
The initial simulator tests were done on a single-sized prosthesis. Remember now, this came in 12 different sizes, placed at a static, perfect angle. Knowing that surgeons all over the world with different training and different experience dealing with different anatomies were going to be putting the cup in at different angles, it was put in at what can only be described as the perfect angle, simulated in a only partially realistic way.
The initial lab testing of the ASR failed to predict the damage the device would cause in real patients in real life, as Graham Isaac, a senior Depew engineer, was forced to concede at trial.
Now, the laboratory simulator testing you did on one head size did not predict that this product would be recalled, did it?
No, it did not.
It did not predict a 40% failure rate in Australia, did it?
It did not, no.
It did not predict 8,000 premature U.S. revisions, did it?
It didn't, no.
It did not predict the frequency of pseudotumors, did it?
No, it did not.
It did not predict the number of people who would ultimately develop painful pep loosening, did it?
No, it did not.
And it did not predict the number of people with adverse tissue reactions from metal, did it?
No, it did not.
In Australia, Ron Barnes was a victim of the company's failure to properly test the device. After having his right hip replaced with an ASR, metal debris from the joint destroyed the tissue around it, as the surgeon who later removed the device discovered.
A lot of the flesh had turned black, and he had to cut away a lot of more flesh and more muscle than they would in normal circumstances.
There's 3 here, 1 there, there, and there's 1 down here on the smelly one too.
4 more operations were needed to deal with a serious infection, culminating in the decision to remove his hip altogether.
And this locust is going to be attracting the birds. Yeah.
Now he too is one of the walking wounded.
It's all over the lawn and bits with the dog.
One thing that we used to do, it's a silly little thing, but we'd go shopping and we'd always hold hands. I can't hold hands with him anymore because he's got to carry the walking frame. It's only a silly little thing to most people, I suppose, but to us that was a big part of our life.
The ASR was launched in Europe in 2003, and around the world, DePuy's sales reps worked hard to persuade surgeons to stop using the Birmingham hip and switch to the ASR. In the north of England, Anthony Nargol was one of them.
I was shown videos, I was shown quite detailed information of how they tested the ASR, and they showed it compared to the Birmingham, and they showed it compared to the Pinnacle hip, and on paper it looked excellent.
But the methods used by the DePuy sales staff were questionable at best.
What the DePuy representatives, I'm told, were doing was bringing 2 bottles of fluid to surgeons who were BHR users. And they would show them 1 bottle of fluid, and it was clear synovial fluid, and another bottle of fluid which was black.
They showed the fluid that came off the simulators. With the ASR, it was pristine, and with the Birmingham, it went all black and horrible. And they said to me, look, I know you're having no problems with your Birminghams, but in a few years' time, that is what's going to happen to your patients. The fluid's going to go black, and your Birmingham patients will fail early.
But the sales demonstration was completely misleading. Later research by engineers at Smith & Nephew, the makers of the Birmingham hip, would reveal that the Birmingham hip implants used in DePuy's simulator tests were damaged before the testing was carried out.
It's interesting because what has happened in practice, my Birmingham patients, most of them in those early days have done really well. And the ASR patients, it's fair to say, has been a disaster. Completely the opposite of what the simulation showed me. So it does beg the question, how on earth did the simulator show the wrong results?
It's ironic, isn't it, that they held up 1 bottle of clear fluid and 1 bottle of black fluid, given the results in many of the ASR patients.
Well, black fluid in the laboratory is harmless. Black fluid in patients' hips is a disaster, and high concentrations of cobalt and chromium, we now know, can be toxic to muscle, and soft tissue damage with edge wear of the ASR has been a potent cause of very severe patient wreckage.
From early on, surgeons around the world were confronted with patient wreckage.
I started seeing patients come to the clinic complaining of groin pain, and I saw this once, then twice, then again and again, and I thought there's something wrong here. Then when we opened some of these patients up, we got the same thing, this fluid under pressure. Sometimes it was milky, sometimes it was greeny grey. It looked awful, but associated with necrotic, and the muscle was just being eaten. It was just rotten.
For years, surgeon Tony Nargol monitored the progress of the ASR hip in his patients and reported the failures of the device to the DePuy team here in Leeds in the north of England. He told them everything he knew, but they didn't return the favour. Did they tell you that other surgeons too were experiencing similar problems?
No, this is the extraordinary thing. We were made to feel it was just me. And you do look at, you go home thinking, well, if I'm the only surgeon in the world with this problem, what am I doing wrong? I wasn't told anybody else was having problems. I was told the opposite, that I am the only person having a problem.
So they deceived you?
That's a fair word.
In Europe, as early as 2006, surgeons who'd been selected as key opinion leaders by DePuy stopped using the ASR.
All of this really should have been a red flag that something is definitely wrong here. You have the people who are the most proficient, the most respected, indeed, people they selected as their own so-called knowledge leaders, telling you, I'm not using this device anymore. Somebody should have been listening to that rather than ignoring it, or worse, purposely not communicating that information to other doctors.
What internal company documents reveal is that the concerns being raised by these surgeons were forwarded to the company's marketing department as well as to the company's clinicians to be dealt with. In Britain, in July 2006, John Dougal, a former director of marketing for DePuy, warned, "We need to nip this one in the bud. The last thing we need is insidious gossip leaking out about deflection, unexplained pain and raised ion levels with ASR." But DePuy's marketing managers were facing another challenge from another quarter. Concerns were being raised in Australia by the organisation that monitors artificial joints, the National Joint Replacement Registry.
We were a little bit surprised about the number of revisions occurring. So we did actually sort of wave a flag and said, you know, there may be an issue with the ASR. And that, so we mentioned that in 2006, and that was specifically with the resurfacing device.
While DePuy could reject what individual surgeons were saying, it was harder to ignore a country's regulator. And in 2007, DePuy was forced to respond.
The situation changed the following year when the ASR resurfacing certainly did become statistically significant from other resurfacing devices. And the company did respond on that occasion, and it released a warning on about the device in 2007 to surgeons.
But DePuy's safety alert suggested the surgeons were to blame for not implanting the ASR correctly. There was no admission that the device itself might be failing. The alert provoked a stunned and angry response from Australia's surgeons. One, Rod Dalziel from Melbourne, wrote, "12 months ago I indicated to you that the ASR was a flawed prosthesis and should be withdrawn from the market. To imply that suboptimal patient selection and surgical technique have contributed to the premature failure is absurd." What DePuy never told the surgeons in 2007 was that the ASR device had failed dramatically in recent lab tests, as George Samaras, a biomedical engineer and medical consultant, explained when he appeared as an expert witness for Bill Kransky.
The amount of metal that wore off during that testing process was 16 or 17 times more than their previous product.
Why is that bad?
Well, first of all, it violates their internal standard, that is, that it had to be at least as good, if not better, than their existing product. And second, we know from the literature that you don't want all kinds of metal filings and ground up metal in your body.
DePuy knew in 2007 that the ASR device was shedding massively more metal than other products it already had on the market. Their experts were also aware that the metals being shed, cobalt and chromium, could be toxic. But instead of acting on the adverse results of its tests, DePuy changed the test protocol and gave the ASR a pass mark.
My opinion is that DePuy failed its own safety test, and instead of fixing the device when the test failed, they fixed the test.
In the interests of fixing public perceptions of the ASR, DePuy had already rejected the idea of appointing a toxicologist to the ASR team in case it fueled fears that the metals being shed by the device would give patients cancer.
No toxicologist was brought on board, and at the same time, consistently, no DePuy employee or J&J employee could ever decide or tell us what was a safe level of cobalt and chromium. And to this day, I don't think anyone knows the answer to that.
Well, 2007 was a great year for your hip business. You sold $62 million more hip products last year than you did the year before. Game on!
By 2007, DePuy's senior staff knew that the ASR was failing at very high levels. But that didn't stop the hard sell.
This team rode the hip portfolio workhorse all year long and increased sales of the Summit platform by 35%. They went big on bearings, on the bearing side, and increased their sales of the ASR XL platform by 362%, generating $2 million in incremental sales.
Even as the sales drive intensified, secret plans were drawn up for a safety redesign of the ASR Cup. The project was given a code name.
This is the extraordinary thing. They initially called it the ASR2, and then the name was changed to the Alpha Project. And it's almost like a secret project to redesign the ASR. So in 2007, they must have known the problems.
In April 2008, Depew engineer Graham Isaac warned senior staff that a recent clinical comparison of the ASR and Birmingham hip showed that under certain conditions, ASR is susceptible to extreme metal ion levels, whereas in the hands of the same surgeon, BHR does not have the same problems. In reply, Paul Berman, Depew's director of hip marketing, told his colleagues, "We will ultimately need a cup redesign, but the short-term action is manage perceptions."
The short-term plan was to manage perception. Their words, manage perception. In other words, lie like hell. Don't tell them anything. And after that, they ran the ads that said 99.2% effective.
This is the advertisement that Depew ran in medical journals in 2008, claiming that the ASR had a 99.2% survivorship in patients. But at the Kransky hearings in Los Angeles, despite all evidence to the contrary, Depew engineer Graham Isaac at first refused to concede that the ad was misleading.
And at that point, you knew that there was not 99.2 survivorship everywhere for the ASR, didn't you?
Well, there was the Australian registry data would have been known by then, yes.
Yes. So you think, I guess, it is appropriate and fair when you know it's 95.5% in Australia to tell everyone the device has a 99.2 survivorship. Is that correct?
No, that was the reference that was used. There was other information that could have been used.
Right. But you personally believe this is fine, don't you?
I believe it quotes references a specific piece of information.
You believe to advertise in this way is in no way misleading, don't you?
There was other information there. It states the reference, and the reference was correct.
Doctor, you believe that this is in no way misleading. Isn't that true?
There was other information, but this reference is correct.
You can answer that yes or no. Do you believe that is misleading, yes or no?
Potentially.
Could I have a yes or no, please?
Yes, it could be misleading.
Back in Australia, 2008 was the year Doug Cope and Bob Lugton had their ASRs implanted, with disastrous results for them both. It was also the year when American Joan Wager went to India, one of many Americans who did, to have her right hip resurfaced. The doctor who performed the operation was Dr. Vijay Bose, who's performed thousands of operations using the ASR. Joan Wager, now a client of Mike Kelly's firm, was expecting to get a Birmingham hip.
I was expecting to get a BHR, and I didn't learn that I had gotten an ASR until a few days later when we spoke of this.
2 years later, back in the United States, a swelling appeared on her hip, and eventually Joan Wager was forced to undergo a revision. The surgeon who carried it out made an unpleasant discovery.
In his operating notes, he said that upon opening up the hip joint, there was a veritable geyser of viscous yellow fluid flecked with gray. And he felt that, again, was some metal shed from the ASR and was appalled because he'd never seen that.
Can you show us how this has affected the way you walk, and let's do it without...
Joan Wager used to be a keen dancer. Now, with one leg longer than the other, she struggles to carry out any of the activities she once loved.
My whole range of movement is very, very altered, and I'm very afraid of dislocation. I no longer do yoga. I can't really dance anymore. So it's radically changed the whole trajectory of this stage of my adult life.
Have you been in touch with Dr. Bose since all of this occurred?
I told him initially about the device failing and having to have revision, and he didn't have anything specific to say about me except that he looked up my records, and as far as he was concerned, he had the angles correct, and he didn't really know about the metal shed. Perhaps I had allergies. He really couldn't comment on it, and he wished me all the best.
Did he apologize?
No.
In August 2009, the FDA sounded the death knell for the ASR by turning down DePuy's request for approval to market the ASR resurfacing device in the United States. Senior DePuy executives considered their options. 4 alternatives were discussed, the preferred one to phase out and develop soft landing strategies. Soon afterwards, 23 of the company's most senior executives met at DePuy HQ. These minutes show they decided to get out of Australia quickly and get out of the ASR business. But in the US, the recall of the device was delayed for 6 months to allow remaining stock to be sold. And around the world, strenuous efforts were made to profit from the disaster that the ASR had become.
Dean, tell me about the revision division.
Well, actually, that's a term that I made up, I guess. But what happened was this. At some point, DePuy is replacing a lot of ASRs. And they know they're doing this. And their doctors, their surgeons are doing it. And so they wanted to make sure they sold the doctors another DePuy device, usually the Pinnacle. And then they thought, wow, what a great opportunity. Okay, they're taking it out. We get to sell them another one.
That is extraordinarily cynical business practice, isn't it?
I just, if it wasn't true, you wouldn't believe it. Some of these things, you just wouldn't, you couldn't imagine a company being such a bad citizen.
It would take 3 more months for DePuy to stop selling the device in Australia and close to a year for DePuy to announce a worldwide recall. But still, DePuy refused to publicly acknowledge that the ASR's design was defective.
How could they take this information, see things are worn, look at x-rays, look at blood tests, and then conclude there's nothing wrong with their implant? That is the big question. It just defies belief.
This damning document gives the lie to DePuy's denials. The form, signed in August 2010 by the president of DePuy and handed to the FDA when the worldwide recall was announced, was presented to the jury in the Kransky hearing. DePuy tried to keep it a secret. In the document, DePuy acknowledges that the ASR is a defective product that could cause health problems. And it concedes that the ASR is very likely to result in a health hazard or a health risk.
Well, I refer to it as Exhibit A because it was, in my opinion, all we needed to prove that this DePuy ASR XL was defective. The president and 7 other high executives signed it, all of them. And they checked the box that said defective and likely to cause harm in human beings. How do you now come and say it's not defective? It's like, okay, end of case. Liability is proven.
The ASR XL
After considering the evidence, the jury found in favour of Bill Kransky on his claim that the design was defective and had caused him injury, but declined to issue punitive damages.
Metal-on-metal products.
The jury decided that the device did incorporate a defect as was defined for them, which was essentially that its risks outweighed any benefits, and that the manufacturer could have or should have discovered those. And they made an award in excess of $8 million to Mr. Kransky.
Sadly, Bill Kransky didn't live long enough to receive the payment. He passed away in February this year. And now DePuy has appealed the verdict. In the United States, without admitting liability, Johnson & Johnson and DePuy have offered patients whose ASRs have failed a base payment of $250,000 in compensation. But in Australia, they've offered patients just $33,000.
What does that say about the company?
Well, it says they think Australians are worth less than Americans, I guess. I don't know. It seems absurd, though.
Here in Sydney, a 10-week trial of Australia's class action was due to start next week. It's now been put off till next year after Johnson & Johnson and DePuy submitted nearly 23,000 pages of fresh expert evidence in support of their contention that the device was not defective. But tonight, there's a new revelation. Four Corners has been told that in many instances, the ASR was manufactured outside its correct specifications, making it even more likely that the device would fail.
When we measured the dimensions of the implants, they seemed to be outside of the specification, which was quite extraordinary because it's a precision implant. So we put this to DePuy and we shared some implants with them and said, look, these are out of specification, will you check them? And they came back and said, we've looked at the implants and they're fine. But what was interesting was that they weren't fine.
Did anyone from inside the company ever confirm to you that things were not, in fact, fine?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
I happened to be at a meeting and one of the senior people from the company came up to me and said to me, you know, these implants that you'd brought over were not made correctly, were too small, and it was quite a shock because it was the opposite of what we'd been told by DePuy at the time.
In Australia, the walking wounded struggle on with their disabilities. Not all their injuries are centred around the hip. Bob Lugton and Eileen Webber have each suffered a series of strokes and other neurological disorders which may be related to cobalt poisoning.
My memory is just shot to pieces, especially the short term.
I have a numb feeling in my left arm and I'm on medication now for the rest of my life.
Has it had any other effect on you?
It is my memory that's the other effect. It's terrible, isn't it?
The dawning realization that DePuy and Johnson & Johnson knew early on how destructive the ASR would be has made many of the walking wounded and their surgeons very angry.
As far as I'm concerned, they should be jailed for crippling people's lives when they knew that the damage that could be done to persons in their lives. So, yeah, it's sickening.
I just do clinics now which are called painful groin clinics. That's all I do, all week, every month. Surgeons have put these in, hundreds of these, and it doesn't make you feel very good when you see the human suffering that's resulted about something we've all tried to do to improve things and made things worse. So the human side is pretty desperate.
You would think it a reasonable expectation by a patient that any implant designed for the human body, given what's at stake, would be scrupulously tested by manufacturers to the nth degree. The evidence tonight suggests not so, that this was a case of trust repaid by deceit and betrayal. We asked Johnson & Johnson and DePuy for an interview. They declined. In a written response to the program, DePuy said, "We firmly believe that DePuy acted properly and responsibly with the information it had, and that the full history of the ASR hip system shows DePuy is a company that takes actions when necessary and is standing by patients today." Their full response is on our website. Next week on Four Corners, the Pope's Revolution. Can Pope Francis really reform a scandal-ridden church? Until then, good night.